I guess we'll start kind of where the whole thing started, with my business and just the direction in life. And obviously I've told people a ton of times that, since I was a little child, I was obsessed with reptiles, dinosaurs, all that type of stuff. And I just always remember, it's interesting. I know a lot of people, especially when they get into their teenage years and maybe even closer to getting out of high school, they really start struggling with what they're going to do with their life. Heck, a lot of college people struggle with what they're going to do with their life. I was pretty blessed with one thing, and that thing was that I always knew what I wanted to do with my life. And now, did I know I was going to work with reptiles and breed reptiles and in the wild path that I've been on over the last 30-something years? No way in the world. But I did know I was going to work with animals, because that was all I really ever cared about when I was a kid. That's all I watched on TV. That's every book I ever read was animal based. So I knew I wanted to do that. And I had a special affinity to reptiles. I loved all animals, and I still do, but I definitely had a special affinity towards reptiles. So, I didn't know what was going to happen and how it was going to go on, but I knew I loved them. And there was actually a pet shop. It was called the Pet Vendor, and it was on my way home from school every day. And I know a lot of people are like, oh boy, here we go with the, walk 10 miles uphill every day to school. But I mean, when I was in middle school and high school, they were very close in proximity. I did walk home, not every day, but most days I walked home. And it was literally like a 1.5 mile walk, but it didn't bother me. It was safe and no problem. And one of the reasons why a lot of times did want to walk home, what it was is, I was a single mother family and she worked, so she couldn't pick me up from school. And that was the options I had at the time. So, but what was nice is on the way home, this pet shop was there called the Pet Vendor. And at the time, there was only really 2 pet shops in Michigan that carried reptiles. There was a place called the Tropical Fish Pond, and then there was the Pet Vendor. And prior to that, there was a place called the Black Lagoon, but that was out of business. Yeah, it was a great name,
Yeah.
But it was out of business before I was old enough to even know about it. So I'd heard the lore of the Black Lagoon, but I had never been to the Black Lagoon. And so anyways, the Pet Vendor didn't have like a huge variety of reptiles, but they had a pretty decent amount. And again, there was no other pet shops outside the Tropical Fish Pond that was pretty much almost all reptiles, even though it was called the Tropical Fish Pond. It was almost all reptiles. And still to this day, Jeff G was a legend, and he's out in Arizona now working with tortoises and some stuff like that. But he used to supply like Alice Cooper with the snake that he traveled with on tour. And so when you would go there was this huge cage that had Alice's Cooper snake in it when he wasn't on tour. So it was just
badass.
It was a cool place.
Yeah,
and
that's
it wasn't
really cool.
far from the Detroit Zoo. So when I could get out there, I'd always got that. But it was like, 10 miles from my house. So I had to get a drive, obviously, to get out there. I didn't get out there that often. But the Pet Vendor was on my way home every day. So literally every day, or 4 out of 5 days during the school week, I would walk home and I would stop at the Pet Vendor, and I'd spend anywhere from like a half hour to sometimes 3 hours a day at the Pet Vendor. And just kind of knew got friends with the people that worked there, and even the owner was always pretty cool with me. And finally, there was an opening to take care of. I was like, just under, I wasn't even 15. I was like 14 and a half years old. And they brought me on to care for the reptiles. And again, I wasn't, obviously at 14, I'm not an expert on reptiles by any stretch. So, they were teaching me. Basically, all I was doing was just cleaning cages, right? Every day you had to clean the cages and water them and stuff like that. And they had a pretty high standard, for care, because every single day, every single cage had to be cleaned, which was pretty awesome for a pet shop. And I learned a lot about reptiles I worked there for like 5.5 years, 4.5, 5 years between that one. And then we actually opened up a second shop that I was actually the manager of, but It was the same type of deal. And during that time, a guy named Mark Bell, who runs a company now that's called Reptile Industries down in North Naples, and supplies all the Pet Supplies Plus and a good majority of PetSmart, not to mention tons of mom and pop shops. As a matter of fact, Mark and Kim Bell at Reptile Industries really is the largest reptile company in the world,
Wow.
which is interesting because most people have never even heard of them.
Yeah,
right?
yeah. I've heard of Bell and stuff through their morphs, but like, that's crazy.
Yeah, like the Bell albino and leopard
Yeah.
geckos came from Mark and Kim Bell, but they have a unbelievably massive collection, but it's completely closed. Like no one's allowed there. You can never go video it. You can never go take pictures. They don't allow you to visit.
Wow.
They're very very
crazy.
closed off. But what happened was they were actually from this area here up in Michigan, and Mark used to supply the pet vendor. He literally worked as a gas line X-ray technician. That's what his job. That's what his job was, And on the side, he bred snakes and mice and rats. So we'd buy mice and rats from Mark and Kim, and we'd buy the occasional snake. Sometimes, mainly it was like corn snakes, and obviously it was way before the ball python trade. And we just, so I got to kind of know Mark, and at the time he just had a basement full of snakes, maybe 200 snakes. Again, almost all colubrids, a few pythons and boas, but mainly all colubrids. So I got to know him through the pet shop, and ultimately he invited me over to his house one day. And I saw his snakes there, and we just kind of started to, over the course of a year or two, became friends. And I started buying snakes directly from him rather than from the pet shop, right? And it was mainly corn snakes, king snakes, stuff like that, because he was mainly that way. But that was in the very beginning when albino Burmese pythons were just about coming on the thing. Now, this is fast forward to when I was 16, almost 17 years old. By this time, I had a couple hundred snakes in my mom's basement, and I had been breeding some things. And as a matter of fact, it's interesting, the first snakes I ever bred were actually a pair of corn snakes from the pet vendor. So the pet vendor,
that's awesome.
Yeah, the pet vendor, some people came in and brought a pair of adult corn snakes. And I convinced the owner of the pet shop to sell them to me. He was going to sell them, and I go, can I buy these? And I'll never forget. I was obviously you brumate colubrids in order to produce, and I suck them in this little cellar area in my mom's basement that was about 55, 60 degrees under the stairs, and usually we brumate for about 3 months. I was so excited about this, I brumated them for 12 days.
Oh, no way.
And I was I've got to bring them out of hibernation. I've got to bring them out of brumation and start breeding these things. So I brumated them for 12 days, started feeding them, started breeding them, and had my first clutch. It was 22 eggs.
Wow.
My first clutch of eggs ever after a 12-day brumation. And then we hatched all 22 babies. I sold, I think, about 18 of them back to Matt at the pet vendor for $10 a piece. And then I kept like 2 pair to raise up, just because of nostalgia or whatever the case is.
You were probably freaking out too, man.
Oh my gosh, I'll never forget the first. I'll never forget when I got the clutch of eggs. It was like the most incredible feeling I've ever had. And then of course, that 58 days of incubation was probably the most painful 58 days.
Yeah, for sure. Because you're like, come on, please just hatch out, be fine.
But I remember when the babies hatched out, just being like, wow. And that's really what started my career breeding snakes. That was like the culmination. I finally bred snakes for the first time, and then, like I said, right around that time, albino Burmese pythons came onto the scene, and that was the first really investment snake, right? And a guy named Anson Wong, who was a world-renowned smuggler of reptiles over in Southeast Asia, and Tommy Crutchfield were friends, and so Tommy brought in this albino Burmese python from Anson, ultimately sold it to Bob Clark. Bob Clark bred it, produced them, and then they were, all of a sudden, that was the first investment snake. And so by this time, Mark and Kim had grown from like their basement to now their basement and their garage full of snakes. And he had kind of gotten into Burmese pythons and a bunch of other pythons and boas as well, D'Albert's pythons, stuff like that. So his collection was really growing. Still working as a gas line weld or X-ray technician. Kim was working full-time with snakes at that point, just because she was a stay-at-home mom and all that other stuff. So she was doing that. Mark was working his job. But Mark got albino Burmese pythons from Bob Clark. They were $1,600 a piece, and he bought like 40 of them to resell some. So I'm assuming he got them at a cheaper price. Because he bought he bought a bunch of them. And I went over, and I'll never forget sitting in Mark's living room And when the shipment arrived, and because he knew I was going to buy a pair for $3,200, and again, that was like every dollar I had to my name was $3,200. I had like $3,400. Let's say.
Yeah.
And somehow I convinced my mom to let me take all this money and buy a pair of albino Burmese pythons. So I was super excited. I go over to Mark's house. Unbagging these things. They're biting the living shit out of us. I mean, we're both bleeding like crazy. I don't really know how to sex snakes, so I'm just holding on to them. Mark is sexing them and setting the males in this pile, females in this pile, and they all look pretty much the same. But I remember, again, getting bit a ton because I just kept on looking like, which one am I going to take? Which albino Burmese am I going to pick for my first albino Burmese? And at the time, I had a giant female named Cleo Burmese python that I had acquired that was like a legit 18, 19 foot, 180 pound female. And so I'd never bred Burms, but I had this big girl as well. And sure enough, I pick out this pair of albino Burmese pythons. And in the meantime, I went from breeding the one corn snakes to, producing quite a few corn snakes, some Solomon Island boas. I even produced Dumerals boas, which was pretty rare back in that time. I had Brazilian rainbow boas. I had a whole bunch of stuff, but the albino Burmese were going to be that was the creme de la creme, right? Wow, I get this pair of cutting edge albino Burmese pythons. And so sure enough, we raised those up, myself and Lori. By this time, Lori was in the scene now. She was part of my life, and we bred the male albino to Cleo. And then we bred the albinos together. And what's interesting is I only saw copulation one time. Now that male bred Cleo probably 15 times.
Wow.
And and kept putting him in with the albino female. Kept on putting him with the albino female. Nothing. And then finally, I saw one copulation at 2 o'clock in the morning. I just go down there. My bedroom was downstairs, so I used to wake up in the middle of the night with the flashlight and go in there and look.
Try to see if they were catch him up.
And finally, I see him hooked up one time. Sure enough, she ovulates. She laid 22 eggs that year. Cleo laid 58 eggs, I believe it was, that were all heterozygous. But what was funny, when I was pulling the eggs from the female albino, which weirdly enough I never named, which is weird. It is weird, right? That for a big part of my career, nothing was hardly nothing was named
at all.
A few out of the thousands of animals I had, just a couple were actually named.
Ones that probably meant a little bit more. Maybe it was your first of a specific snake or something.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But most of my stuff I wouldn't name. Now it's almost everything I name. Almost every time.
And I love that too. It gives you such a cool connection to the animal.
I think so.
Yeah, I do too.
Can we rail this in?